It's another month, so let's look back at all the films and TV shows that I watched in the month of May. Starting with Reservoir Dogs. This is the second Quentin Tarantino film I watched after Pulp Fiction last year, and I think it's nearly as good. I like the use of time jumps and only revealing certain stuff at certain points in the film, which leads to a basically perfect final act. I do think it left me in the dark for a lot of the first act, and I found myself a bit disinterested because of that. But when everything was revealed, I just became so much more invested, and it just made me rethink everything that happens in the first half of the film. It's just a really great directorial debut from Tarantino. I give it 9.5. Then I finally watched Godzilla -1. I was gagging to watch this film because I missed it when it was in cinemas, but it finally came out on digital, and it's just as good as everyone was saying. The story going on here was just great, and I love how it deals with themes of guilt through the character of the kamikaze pilot who just couldn't fill out his duty. They managed to make the human characters in a Godzilla film very interesting, which the MonsterVerse films just could not do at all. The CGI looks phenomenal here as well for the film's budget, and it really did deserve that Oscar. And the final act pulled so many twists and turns that actually surprised me, and it ends in a pretty satisfying way as well. I give it a 9.5 again. And then I watched Boxcar Bertha. I wanted to go back and watch some of Scorsese's earlier films other than the ones I watched last month. I just wanted to do a clean run of all his filmography, starting with this film, and it was a very odd time. The story was extremely uninteresting, and literally all the characters were the most uninteresting wooden blocks I've seen in a film probably. I might be too harsh, but I just could not care less about a word that came out of anyone's mouth, which is kind of ironic because you can't actually hear what some of the people are saying in some scenes. People are speaking or shouting, and I don't know if they forgot to do the ADR or they didn't have enough money to do it, but it's just silence, and it makes everything so awkward and sometimes ironically funny, especially during fight scenes where there's just no grunts or anything. It's just punching noises. You can see some of Scorsese's filmmaking techniques shine through here in the cinematography side of things, with some interesting shots here and there, but that's the only thing that kind of saved the film for me. It might just be a 4. Then I rewatched Rise of the Planet of the Apes. I wanted to rewatch the Apes trilogy for the new film that came out, and this is just an extremely solid film on rewatch. It really begins Caesar's story extremely well and already gives him so much character development in this film. The CGI also looks surprisingly great for 2011 as well, and Andy Serkis puts in just an amazing physical performance when playing Caesar, and it just makes him so much more believable. I do think some of the human stuff with the cure for Alzheimer's and that, it is pretty predictable, and you can see everything going downhill from a mile away, but it sets everything up for the next film, which gets to explore the effects of that. I do think the third act on the bridge wasn't as engaging as I wanted it to be, but yeah, apart from that, it's just a great starting point for the trilogy. I give it an 8.5. And I watched The Fall Guy. I watched this in cinemas with my dad, and I don't think he liked it that much. He was a big fan of the original show, and he said he watched it every week, and I don't have that same connection to the property. But I really enjoyed this film. I didn't expect it to be as much of a rom-com as it was, but I like the relationship between Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt's characters and where that goes, especially in the third act. There's some just really great shots in here that really surprised me as well, and some great one-shot scenes that work really well as well and build the atmosphere of the movie sets. The stunts are obviously a massive standout, as it's a massive ode to stunt work in movies, and that passion for stunt work really comes through on the screen. It's just a fun time. I give it an 8. Then I watched Baby Reindeer. This is a show that a lot of people were talking about, and it started like a dark comedy, and then it progressively got darker and darker, and by the end it almost feels like a complete different show. My mind was blown when I found out that the actor who played the main character was the actual guy that the events of the show happened to, and I respect him so much for being able to reenact some of these moments in his life. A lot of moments that don't even paint him as a particularly likable person, and that vulnerability and experience comes through the screen so well in this show. The writing is great as well, and it's so interesting seeing how he portrays these events and how he's feeling in moments of his life. It also ends in a pretty tragic way that hopefully isn't a position that this guy is in now, but it's just a great show front to back, and there were too many uncomfortable scenes to count. But yeah, I give it a 9. And then I finished watching Regular Show season 3. I did think this season was a bit long, but I still really love it. Again, just some weird and wacky concepts that are just really fun. There are some episodes that are less creative than others, but when those episodes are good, they're really good. So I give it a 9. And then watch Abigail. It's from the same directors as Ready or Not and Scream 5 and 6. And I think they're kind of moulding their own unique style with their films. And they also really like large houses and exploding bodies. I think this is their weakest film, but it's still really great. I really like the twists and turns that this film takes. And also like how the people you root for change very often as well, which I like. I like a big goofy third act in my horror films. So I really enjoyed where the third act of this film went. When I've seen a lot of people complain about the third act. Abigail's actor is amazing as well, and she does a really great job at acting as this vulnerable girl and then switching up and acting like this 100-year-old vampire. It's just overall a very fun watch. I give it an 8. And then watch Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. This was fine. I think the main problem is that it doesn't feel enough like a Ghostbusters film. I feel like the odd humour that didn't work in Afterlife is cranked up to 10 here, and there's some really predictable moments involving some characters that I kind of just rolled my eyes at. There are some new fun ideas that I liked, like the machine that separates your soul from your body. That's pretty interesting, but I think they underused it. And you've also got a character basically becoming a firebender by the end. It dragged in a lot of places as well, and I have to agree with some other people saying that there's way too many characters in here and they're balanced out pretty poorly. I give it a 6. And then I finished watching Clarkson's Farm 3. This was just another great season of Clarkson's Farm. It's just really interesting seeing how a farm works again, and it documents that extremely well. There also seems to be constant problems at Diddley Squat, and it's pretty stressful seeing everyone trying to resolve it. There's some great stuff with the introduction the pigs in here as well, and some really emotional moments involved with the babies. I do think that the finale was less uneventful than I was expecting, especially compared to the last season, but it's still a great season. I'll give it a 9. And then I'll rewatch Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I think I like this film more on rewatch, maybe because I was pretty ill the first time I saw this. I think I had a really bad cold and I was bedridden probably. But this film was so good. The style that Matt Reeves brings to this trilogy is great. There's so many phenomenal shots in here and some unbelievable CGI for the apes, which just looks amazing for its time. I love the character arc that Caesar goes on throughout this film as well, and the conflict that goes on between him and Cobra is just so interesting. You've also got some really interesting human characters, and it continues the story with the flu really well from the last film, with a good majority of mankind being wiped out and only these small societies remaining. It's just a great film. I love the story, I love the characters. I give it a 9. And then I watched Ready Player One. I get why people hate this film, but I had a good time with it. The concept I thought was really strong, with this kind of post-apocalyptic world where no one wants to exist in the real world anymore, and this virtual reality world is really cool and really well built out. I do think the main character is a little uninteresting, and it does look a bit goofy when it's in this VR world and then it cuts back to the actual actor with his headset on. It was a bit distracting. I also think that it kind of becomes an IP slop fest at the end. There's just so many references and cameos and licensed songs, and it kind of feels like the filmmakers were kind of showing off, and I think it could have been a much better film if all that visual overload was just left out in favour of the actual story. I like the relationship between these two characters, but you don't spend enough time with them, especially in the real world. I do really like the creator of the whole VR thing though, and the whole quest and this cartoonishly evil villain. It was just fun, and I wasn't really that distracted in the 2-hour 20-minute runtime, so I guess that's a good sign. I give it a 7. And then what? Kill Bill Volume 1. This just feels like a love letter to anime from Tarantino. There's a lot of absurdist action in here where blood is spurting from everyone like a hose, and people are doing backflips like 10 meters in the air, and it's just a very fun time. The main character of the bride is just a really interesting character to follow as well, and I like how it really shows her vulnerability and emotional side as well as a threatening and ruthless side. Out of any film that I've watched, I think this film explores the theme of revenge the best, and just does a great job at explaining her reasoning and anger behind this revenge rampage. I give it a 9. And then watch Kill Bill Volume 2. There's a very solid second half. I disagree with the people saying that the 2 volumes should have been 1 film, because this half feels pretty different in my opinion. You get a lot more flashbacks and explorations into the bride's backstory and the titular Bill that she wants to kill. It's a lot more slower paced as well, and I do think the first quarter of the film felt a bit too slowly paced compared to the last film, but it really picked up during the middle half and I was just loving it. And then the last part of the film kind of slowed down again, but I was still liking it. I really do like Bill as a character as well, and they carried through with that cliffhanger from Volume 1 really well. I give it an 8.5. And then I finished watching X-Men 97. I thought this was a really amazing season of television. Like I mentioned in last month's video, I've only watched the first season of the original series and I didn't think it was anything special. But this season was definitely special. I think it catches everyone up on what happened in the last series pretty well, and the plot points going on about the discrimination against mutants and the fight for mutants to have social equality. I find that aspect of the X-Men to be like the most interesting part, and they delved into it really well here. The animation is also phenomenal, and the incorporation of 3D elements just elevates everything, and all the fight scenes are all so fluid and vibrant. It's just great. I do think some story points are kind of rushed over a bit, and there were some moments where I thought I missed an episode because they would just drop me right into the middle of something that we didn't see much of in a previous episode, and because of that I did find it a bit tricky to follow some of the plot lines. But apart from that, it's just a really great show and probably one of the best from Marvel. I give it an 8.5. And then I rewatched War for the Planet of the Apes. I actually think Dawn is the better film on rewatch, but this is still really close. It brings Caesar's character arc to a really satisfying ending and makes the villain of this film, played by Woody Harrelson, kind of understandable, and I kind of felt bad when what happened to him. They really fleshed out the side characters as well, like Maurice, who's just on a whole nother level as a character compared to the last two films. There's some aspects that might be retreads of previous films, like Caesar breaking all the apes out, and I'm not gonna lie, I do think Bad Ape and his humour felt a little out of place in this very serious story, even though he might be the best character in the whole trilogy, I'm not gonna lie, because he's played by Frank Clefley, the goat, okay? But overall, it's a great conclusion to a great trilogy. I give it a 9. And then I watched Mean Streets. This is another Scorsese film that I wanted to tick off in his filmography, and this one I didn't really care all that much for, even though you've got some great performances in here from Henry Cavill. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Harvey Keitel.
And Robert De Niro, which is his first ever time he was in a Scorsese film. I just felt like a good chunk of this film was just New York gangsters goofing around, and the plot wasn't really moving along at all. I just kind of zoned out in some scenes. It is a massive improvement over Boxcar Bertha, don't get me wrong. The needle drops in this film are great, there's some amazing cinematography, and I do like how it ramped up a bit in the final act, but it's overall just not Scorsese's best film. I give it a 6. And then I watched Challengers. This is probably the craziest love triangle film I've seen, even though I haven't seen that many love triangle films. Zendaya did a great performance in this film, and it doesn't really feel like a typical role for her, which I liked. I like how everything is linked into the sport of tennis and how competitive of a sport it can be. The style that the director brings to this film as well is amazing, and there's some baffling shots in here that I don't even know how they achieved. The soundtrack of this film is the thing that really stands out the most, and I love a bit of 9 Inch Nails, so Trent Reznor was just a really great addition to the film, and just that pulsating synth music just added so much to the tension going on. I also really like how the film was very non-chronological and jumps back and forwards in time to reveal more and more about this extremely messy and weird relationship, and it adds more and more tension to this present day scene going on that the film keeps returning to. I just really love this film, and it's just one of my favourites of the year so far. I give it a 9. And then I watched Alice Isn't Here Anymore. This has got to be Scorsese's most underrated film. I mean, I haven't finished his filmography yet, but this is one on Letterboxd that isn't that highly rated, and not many people have rated it at all, but it's great. I love this film. It was very funny as well, maybe even more so than After Hours. The writing in here is just so sharp, and I just love this relationship between this mother and a son, and it reminded me a lot of like a late 80s John Hughes film with how the jokes were paced and edited, but this came out in the early 70s, and it just goes to show how ahead of his time Scorsese was, really. The story really progresses in a really fun way as well, and you really want this woman to get a dream job and fall in love again. This is a surprisingly woman-centric film from Scorsese as well, which I don't think he did before, and I don't think he ever did again. I don't think he tackled it really well, even though I'm not a woman, but this was just a pleasant surprise from Scorsese. I give it a 9. Apologies if I look like I've taken drugs or something. I went to the opticians and they just put an eye drop in one of my eyes, which dilates my eye, so I look like I'm on some kind of drugs, but I'm not. Then I watched 3000 Years of Longing. This is yet another weird and wacky film from the director of the Mad Max films. I get how people don't like this film because a majority of it is flashbacks, but it ties these flashbacks into the main present story really well, and it adds so much context to the character of the Djinn, who is played really well by Idris Elba, and you really feel sorry for this guy as he doesn't get his 3 wishes. I'm not the biggest fan of the main character, played by Tilda Swinton. She's just a bit forgettable, and her character goes in a very odd direction in the 3rd act. I just feel like the Djinn's character was developed too much, and her character wasn't developed enough, so it made for a very unbalanced film, I'd say. It does have the signature style of a George Miller film, though. I give it an 8. And then I watched Solo Leveling. I went in very blind on this series, just hearing people say it was good. The concept of this really feels like a classic anime story with this wimp who suddenly gains powers and learns how to use them. But this show really tackles social hierarchy and the politics of this world, which I found really interesting. The main character is much more likeable than someone like Izuku from My Hero Academia or Tanjiro from Demon Slayer. He's just much less over the top, and the show as a whole isn't edited like a typical anime and seems to take more inspiration from more Western shows, and that more serious and realistic style really works for this type of show, I'd say. I give it an 8.5. And then watch Civil War. I don't think this film hits home as much as the film wants it to because I'm not an American, but this film is still great nonetheless. I've never seen Kirsten Dunst play a role this serious before, and she does a great job at playing this war photographer who is desensitized to everything and doesn't want this young photographer to fall down the same path. There's some really great and really haunting shots in it, and I like how the soundtrack to this film kind of contrasts the imagery going on. I think a big problem with this film is that it peaked at the Jesse Plemons scene. It's just probably the most nail-biting scene I've seen this year so far, and it's just so great that everything else after, in comparison, is a little bit boring until they get to the White House. Overall though, I really liked it. I give it an 8.5. And then I watched Schindler's List. This was just a perfect Spielberg film that's just presented these very real events in a very visceral and horrific way. I haven't seen Liam Neeson put in a performance this good ever. He just did a great, amazing performance as Schindler, and I just love the character arc he goes on throughout the film, and how he went from only caring about money to becoming more and more sympathetic towards the Jews and wanting to save them from dying. This film was extremely long, at over 3 hours, but it kind of needs that length to make the statement that it needed to make and have the impact that it did. I wouldn't think in a million years that the same guy who directed this directed Ready Player One, but here we are. I give it a 10. And then watch Inglorious Basterds. This is another film about Nazis, but this time it's much less depressing and much more satisfying because a bunch of Nazis die in this film. This was just so fun front to back with so many tense moments and really good payoffs. Brad Pitt? Bro, the autocorrect completely messed up on that. Brad Pitt is really funny with this American accent, and it's just so great seeing him try to speak Italian. The hyperlink aspect is pretty great as well, and I like how all of these stories collide in the cinema in the final act. I do think some problems that hyperlink films face is they struggle to balance all these characters out, and I do think that for some characters in this film, but overall it's just another almost perfect Tarantino film. I give it a 9.5. And then watch Furiosa and Mad Max Saga. I've already done an unscripted movie review on this film, but long story short, it's just really good. It's my favourite film in the Mad Max franchise, and I thought Chris Hemsworth was a massive standout in here. Great performances from everyone all round, and just great direction from George Miller. And then watched Let It Be. I watched Get Back when it came out, and I wanted to see how this film held up in comparison, especially now that it's been newly restored. And it definitely looks miles better than Get Back. There's no massive amounts of like digital noise reduction being applied, and you can really just tell how far AI has improved over these 2 years by just comparing these two restorations. But that's really the only benefit as over Get Back. I just think this is more like an album film with the band just playing songs from Let It Be and Abbey Road with a few little fun interactions in between, whilst Get Back is like an 8-hour deep dive into how the songs were developed and all the troubles the band were having at the time, and it's just way more interesting. I do think this is still really well edited though, and if I had watched this before Get Back, I still would have found it to be a very interesting look into the Beatles in the studio. The rooftop performance is just amazing as well. It's just iconic. I give it an 8. And then watch The Omen. This is a very solid horror film with just expertly done kills and a great story. I know going in that Richard Donner directed this, who directed the first Superman film 2 years later, and you can really feel that same signature style in this film. The kill scenes are so good in this film as well. There's just such a great build up to them, and you can really feel the impacts of them, even though some of the practical effects look better than others. The actual plot of this child who's actually demonic, and this father being in denial but slowly discovering more and more. I really like that aspect. I just really like this film overall. I give it 9. And I watched South Park: The End of Obesity. I watched season 20 of South Park last year, and I wanted to check out this new special to see if the show still hits. And I really did like this episode. It's definitely not as perfect as those early South Park episodes, but it still has some really great social commentary, this time on the use of Ozempic, and also has some really well written jokes. I also didn't feel like I missed as much as well, even though I skipped like 7 seasons of the show, and it felt like a really good re-entry point. I just think it's a really solid special. I give it 7.5. And then I watched The First Omen. This film felt suspiciously similar to Immaculate plot-wise, and I think this film did it better. I like how it connects itself very satisfyingly to the First Omen film. No, I mean the First Omen from the 70s. The last Omen film that I watched. This film also has some genuinely terrifying imagery and uses the breaking of the fourth wall in a very creepy way as well. I don't think that the character of the nun is as interesting of a character to follow as the dad in the first film, but there's just so many fun twists and turns with her character that made her a very good main character to follow. I don't think the death scenes are as impactful as the first film as well, and some I could see coming from a mile away. Like there's one death scene where someone's walking backwards into a road and you know exactly what's going to happen. Whilst in the first film, the deaths were just really unpredictable and just so much more shocking. It's still a very solid prequel though, and I didn't expect Bill Nye to be in here as well. I give it an 8. And then I watched The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. This is an alright Ritchie film. I think there's a lot of fun action in here, and Henry Cavill is a big standout as this leader of a gang of crazy people who Winston Churchill appoints to kill Nazis. Again, another Nazi film. I thought there were some side plots that were going on that lost me a bit, and there were some times where the story would trail off in a direction that wasn't all that interesting. I do realise that it was based on a true story, but a lot of things in here just fell very flat, and there was hardly any Guy Ritchie flavour in this film at all, in my opinion. I give it a 6. And then I watched Summer Shogun. I'm sorry, but I dropped this a quarter into episode 3. I was actually getting physically upset and frustrated at how much I couldn't get into this show. I was getting teary-eyed. I wanted to love this show so much, but it's a very lore-heavy show with a lot of dialogue and exposition, and I personally just found it very hard to latch onto. And it got to a point where I was just watching these scenes and I couldn't remember all these characters' names and all these places, and I couldn't follow a thing going on, and I just decided it's not worth continuing, even though I heard it's an amazing show. I might return to it, but yeah, I'm sorry. And then the final film that I watched this month was Django Unchained. This is my favourite Tarantino film now. I just thought it was perfect front to back, and it's also similar in a way to Inglorious Basterds, as they both have satisfying third acts where the protagonists kill a bunch of racists. I really love Django's character in it, and he's played really well by Jamie Foxx. Christopher Waltz is probably my favourite character in here, as he's a white person who is not racist. He also has this great relationship with Django that I really liked, as they both go about bounty hunting. Tarantino manages to really get across how disgusting of a period this was in history, with everyone having dirty teeth and obviously the horrors of the slave trade, and it's dealt with really well. It's perfect. I give it a 10. So those are all the films and TV shows that I watched in the month of May. I'm currently watching Smiling Friends season 2. This is just an almost perfect season already, and I'm only a few episodes in. It's just really unique humour that works so well with the crazy animation, and there's been some really fun cameos in here as well. And I'm also watching My Adventures with Superman season 2. I've only seen the first 2 episodes, but it's kind of started out a bit boring. I think it picked up a bit in the second episode, and the appearance from a character at the end did get me a bit excited, but I'm not on the edge of my seat waiting for another episode or anything. So if you really like, if you didn't like it, dislike, and I'll see you next time.